Noches a todos y todas. Desde Argos, Observatorio Internacional de Migraciones y Derechos Humanos, PM Press y CODPIN, queremos darle la bienvenida a este foro sobre migración y asilo, industria y negocio detrás de la movilidad humana. Es un gusto presentar el día de hoy a este importante panel y abordar un tema tan complejo y con tantas aristas como es el negocio y el lucro de los que están sometidas las personas que se encuentran en procesos de movilidad humana y como son los solicitantes de asilo y las y los migrantes. El día de hoy queremos discutir en torno a la movilidad humana y cómo este derecho se enfrenta a muchas barreras que dificultan su garantía, tanto barreras físicas, pero también se ve involucrado y se enfrentan al capitalismo global, a los mercados, a sus gestores, a una burocracia internacional creada para lucrarse con el migrante y el solicitante de asilo o a través de estos y estas. Hoy estaremos discutiendo distintas miradas y aproximaciones con respecto a este fenómeno, con investigadoras, investigadores, activistas de derechos humanos que vienen trabajando el tema desde una visión contrahegemónica, pero una visión profundamente respetuosa de los derechos humanos. Aquí nos acompañan el día de hoy, en primer lugar, Siobhán McGuirk, que es investigadora postdoctoral de la Universidad de Londres, Goldsmith, es doctora en antropología por la American University en Washington, D.C., donde vivió entre 2011 y 2019. Siobhán es periodista, cineasta, curadora y editora de la revista Repita. Bienvenida, Siobhán, a nuestro encuentro del día de hoy. También estaremos hablando el día de hoy con Adrienne Pine. Quiero señalar también que Siobhán es una de las coeditoras del libro que estaremos promocionando el día de hoy, que ya lo van a presentar. También estaremos hablando con Adrienne Pine, que es otra de las coeditoras de este importante libro que estaremos conversando el día de hoy. Es profesora asociada de antropología y directora del programa de Health, Inequity and Care, Desigualdades en Salud y Cuidados en la American University. Ella es antropóloga, médica, militante, y su trabajo se ha centrado principalmente en estudiar el fascismo neoliberal, el imperio y la solidaridad somática entre Honduras y Estados Unidos. Estaremos conversando también con Bartolo Fuentes, que es periodista, educador y activista por los derechos humanos de las personas migrantes. Bartolo es precandidato a diputado al Congreso Nacional por Libertad y Refundación Libre en Honduras, dirigente nacional del Frente Nacional de Resistencia Popular. Bienvenido, Bartolo. Y por último, estaremos conversando con Florencia Mazzadi. Florencia es gestora cultural, activista por los derechos humanos, licenciada en Historia por la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Desde el 2016 es titular a cargo del Centro de Investigación Cine, Derechos Humanos y Migración del Instituto de Altos Estudios Sociales. Desde el 2010 también es presidenta de la Asociación Civil Cine Migrante e integrante del Observatorio Internacional Argos. Es un placer compartir el día de hoy con ustedes. También le queremos dar un caluroso saludo el día de hoy a todos los que nos acompañan a través de nuestras redes sociales y a través también de las redes sociales y del canal de PM Press. Estaremos iniciando el día de hoy con este importante panel que tenemos el día de hoy y me gustaría empezar a conversar el día de hoy con la compañera Siobhán. Siobhán, tú acabas de publicar un libro que se llama Asilo a la venta, lucro y protesta en la industria de la migración, donde junto con Adrienne Pine reúnen una serie de artículos de investigaciones y activistas que denuncian mediante un proceso muy acucioso de investigación y con datos fidedignos la industria y el lucro que está detrás de la migración. Me gustaría que el día de hoy compartas con nuestra audiencia, con el público que nos está viendo el día de hoy, con otros defensores de derechos humanos, pero también con migrantes que están escuchando este evento tan importante, y que nos cuentes un poco sobre este libro y especialmente sobre su argumento central, es decir, ¿por qué considerar a la migración y el asilo como una industria? Bienvenida, Siobhán.
Muchas gracias. Tengo que decir antes que nada que no puedo escuchar la versión en inglés y supongo que tampoco pueden escuchar. Sí, ahora mismo sí.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, okay.
So, la cosa más importante es que la audiencia puede escucharme, ¿no? Hello to everyone. I'm going to speak in English so that I can keep moving at a quick pace. But it's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you so much to Argos, Bartolo, Flor, everyone behind the scenes, Maria, for joining us for this conversation. So this conversation feels very, very current and very present, but we actually started talking about the themes that we explore in our book in 2015. And that was a period where the so-called migration crisis was happening in Europe, across the Mediterranean, and in the United States. Barack Obama was being referred to as the deporter-in-chief because of the unaccompanied children, again, kind of being framed as a crisis coming to the US border. And Adrienne and I both work and carry out research with different populations, working in NGOs, in Adrienne's case as an expert witness, working with lawyers and working with people who are seeking asylum themselves. And while all these crises were going on, or these so-called crises were going on, we were very aware, and we were talking a lot about how the idea of a distinction between the refugee and the economic migrant was becoming increasingly central to these conversations. So this idea of, should we call people a refugee, or can we use the word migrant here, economic migrant particularly? And for both of us coming from a anti-capitalist perspective, a political economy perspective, we were saying, well, really, everyone who's moving is moving for economic reasons, whether they are being forced to move for economic reasons, whether they are being exploited economically as part of the journey, or whether they are being subject to treatments in private detention centres, for example, that are fueled by an industry, industrial actors, and multi-billion-dollar industry. Likewise, the industry of selling arms, that bombs and arms that go to one country and create warlike conditions and conditions of conflict that force people to leave, are oftentimes the same companies that are investing in the securitization of borders. So you can buy a bomb from a company, and then a few years later you can buy a biometric passport system, and they might also build you a watchtower with machine guns on top. So you can get all of those things from the same company that is that's making a lot of profit from the business of war and the business of preventing migration that is caused by those wars. And so we wanted to make an intervention at this point, because we felt that the conversation was missing a critical economic analysis, and particularly around how profits are made and extracted from people who migrate, and particularly asylum seekers. It's quite a narrow focus in some ways to say asylum seekers, but we wanted to kind of explode this idea that asylum seekers are a narrow category, and actually put forward a different proposition, which is that so many people who are being called economic migrants or other forms of migrants could also fit into this category if it was understood more broadly, and in fact if it was understood how it was originally intended, rather than this kind of narrowing definition that we're seeing all over. We also wanted to write a book that wasn't purely intended to reach an academic audience. It wasn't a dry conversation, but also one that was written by people who had direct experience of seeking asylum themselves, or people who had direct experience of migrating, people who work in the asylum industry, broadly understood. So it includes articles by people reflecting on their time held in detention, by people who have, in Adrienne's case, served as an expert witness. In other cases, people who have worked as lawyers in the UK, or social workers. There's pieces by investigative journalists and artists who use graphic novella to tell these stories, often very complex stories as well. So in the book, we also wanted to talk about the guard who is working in a detention centre, oftentimes a very low paid job, a very poorly supported job, a very traumatic job. And looking at those people not as the kind of bad guys in this system, but as workers who are likewise exploited in different ways to the people that they are holding in these prison cells. And so over time, over the last few years, this, as I opened with, this conversation and these themes haven't at all gone away. In fact, in many ways, they've worsened, and we're seeing this across the Americas, with different political movements being tied to the business of borders and border maintenance. And I'm looking forward to joining the conversation further on those themes as part of this discussion tonight. But also, I think it's important to think about the ways in which these dynamics are being reflected and echoed and copied by nation states all over the world. So a kind of what I would say is a terrible idea, but what a government might say is a brilliant idea, to imprison people in an offshore detention centre, is something that 5 years ago we were talking about with reference to Australia, but now we're talking about with reference to the UK, with reference to the United States, and this kind of third country agreement. So that's really situating the book and the argument that we're making in it. And as I said, the conversation is really a present one. So I'll hand back to you, Lucrecia.
Sí, muchas gracias, Siobhán.
Thank you very much, Siobhán, for your interesting ideas. And the situation is extremely sad. The situation confronted by the migrants, those who are subject to these mafias and have to pay the price, the cost of being able to enjoy the right to human mobility. We have also Adrienne, who is the co-editor of this important book that we are introducing today. Based on what Siobhán has mentioned and based on her experience, then can we talk about different type of migrants and why in some cases some governments benefit some type of migrants in detriment to other type of migrants in the various countries? It's a pleasure having you with us, Adrienne. Well, Siobhán was made an excellent summary of our project. And this is a key element of the book, to challenge the model that is shown in the narratives around the world. We have economic migrants and refugees on the other side. What we are saying is that in this industry that includes the detention centers and the technologies mentioned by Siobhán, we have the experts, lawyers, those involved and making money in this process in the countries. where asylum seekers want to, or the destination countries. So in this process, we try to build a story that will be recognized as legitimate in the courts. Of course, we try to be truthful about the situation of the migrants, but in courts, they only recognize certain factors that are important to determine if a person deserves or not asylum. In the case of the US, if, for instance, the US organized a coup d'etat in Honduras, for instance, they have imposed neoliberal policies, they have occupied militarily the whole country, and that has led to the displacement of people and the lack of jobs and the surge of violence. Well, this person uh, is suffering violence in the hands of other Hondurans, but in the courts, you cannot talk about the reality, because there we have a combination of imperialism, economic suffering, and other sufferings that push people to abandon their communities, and no one wants to leave their communities in order to find refuge elsewhere. That is, it is not the American dream, as they call it. And in the courts, you see that it is a political process, not only because we cannot talk about imperialism in the courts, but also there are patterns, statistics that show that give asylum, or they give asylum, or they refuse asylum to people coming from countries that I consider foes of the United States, such as Nicaragua and Venezuela. They're going to give asylum to those people from Nicaragua and Venezuela than people coming from Honduras, even though they are under a drug trafficking president and whose brother has been accused of being drug trafficker. So they give asylum to whom? Well, to those people. We can speak about the TPS. So they give asylum to those requesting asylum coming from countries, enemies of the United States. So those suffer more than those coming from friendly countries.
But also, regarding the TPS, it is a decision that is quite political. For example, who do they grant temporary protection? So recently, they have granted TPS in the United States to citizens from Venezuela. However, they are denying that status or making it difficult for people who come from Haiti, who are actually living a real crisis. Likewise, in the United States, they are forcing many other countries in South America to grant TPS to Venezuelans who are leaving their nation as a result of the unilateral coercive measures that our government has provoked. So, in general, what we see, if we take a look at the general overview, what we see is an industry that is guided by the capitalist and imperialist policies. It is not a humanitarian project as such. It is not a human rights project as such, because it is not applied in a universal manner. Thank you very much, Adrienne. It seems like the migrant is an individual that is in dispute between politics and economy. At some points, they're politically used, but at other moments, throughout their pathways, they have to go through processes of commodification. So it seems like their right is subjected to the economies, mainly of the economies of capitalist countries. I would also like to talk today with Bartolo. Bartolo, it is a pleasure to have you here today. He is from Honduras. He's a journalist. We would also like you to narrate your experience, but we would also like to ask you, based on what we are saying, if you think that the foreign policy of the developed countries is connected to their migration policies. So, how can you configure the law and the state policies with the human mobility processes? Welcome, Bartolo. It is a pleasure to have you here today. Well, thank you very much. Well, the migration policies of the United States, even of Mexico and of other Central American countries, are in tune with the aggressive policies against countries and against the people who flee the conditions that we are living here right now. Specific cases could imply a threat posed by Donald Trump to Mexico and to impose economical sanctions if they did not stop the caravans of migrants that were leaving Honduras, or the imposition of Donald Trump against Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador in order to sign a third safe country agreement, which is something absurd because from these three countries is from where thousands of people are fleeing. They're fleeing the realities that they're facing, and they're declared as the third safe country. So I would say that this is like another wall that the United States has wanted to live on the border with Guatemala. And we have seen how the troops of Guatemala have attacked women, children, defenseless women inside the territory of Guatemala with tear gas canisters, hitting people, beating people, people who are just fleeing from Honduras. We could see this in January last year in Guatemala. We saw that there were 7,000 people, low-income people, people who are going in a caravan is because they do not have the possibility to pay for their own trip. They cannot even pay a coyote, the way many people do in order to enter the United States. In other words, the migratory or the migration policies, as the other speakers said, are beneficial for some governments, but are or represent an attack for other countries. They even threatened with invading Venezuela because people were desperately fleeing and it was necessary to resort to the rescue of these populations. But when the caravans of people from Honduras left, nobody said anything. On the contrary, they protect this government that, besides being a narco government, it has looted the funds of the state. We have no education, no housing, no health. We have no possibility to live in a dignified manner within our territory. But because the government is friends with the United States and because they recognize the government of Venezuela and they're form part of the plans of invading other countries. Remember that there are 7 military bases of the United States in Honduras. There are no sanctions. There are no threats of any kind. I do believe that the foreign relations are using the same migration policies to pressure the neighboring countries such as Mexico and the Central American countries in order for it to be allies. Both the anti-migration policies of the United States as well as the aggression policies of the countries that do not follow their guidelines around the world. Thank you very much, Bartolo. I think that what you have just mentioned is quite important. And throughout the forum and the discussion that we have today, we would like you to provide further detail on the topic regarding the caravans and the situation that migrants are facing, migrants who are just searching for a better life and are confronting obstacles for them to reach their country of destination. We will also talk today with Florencia. Florencia is from Argentina. She's also a specialist in the topic of migration. She's a member of the Argos Observatory. Welcome, Florencia. It is a pleasure to have you here with us today. We would like you, Florencia, to talk about this topic. We have seen the discussion of Siobhán and Adrienne about the book. The book is focused on the relationships between the asylum and the consolidation of imperialism and the importance it has on the determination of law. So within the framework of Argos, we have developed a series of researches on the modes of externalization of the borders. In that sense, we would like you to say, how do you consider the relationship is between this and the cinema industry? Hello, good evening to everyone. Most of all, I would like to thank you for giving me the possibility to participate in this event, both as a defender of human rights as well as a member of the observatory. I think that meeting here and talking about the book is a reflection of the fact that not only those of us who work inside the territory defending the rights of the migrants always talk about the arbitrariness of what the difference is between the migrants and refugees, and arbitrariness that gives the border control the power to decide who lives and who cannot cross a border and have a possibility to live. But also because it relates and talks about the differences that sometimes are well considered in the human rights organizations and in the agendas of the government, and that are part of the permanent production of precarization. They're part of the permanent production and distinction of the world of who can survive and who only have the right to die. So in this sense, as Lucrecia mentioned, in Argos, we have thought that one of the main guidelines for working has to do with disseminating what is happening not only on the border, but also the way in which the policies apply. We must also disseminate the information about how that border has different degrees throughout the territory. Today, we not only understand that we have to study in detail the border, the northern border between Mexico and the United States. We also have to take a look at the Mediterranean Sea border. We also have to analyze how the government establish many mechanisms so that the physical border of the state and the nation is the last mechanism for the crossing of a migrant person. Why? Well, because throughout the entire territory, like Bartolo said, throughout the entire route of the migrant, the interventions of the central countries or the interventions of the well-called criminal north countries are the ones that establish through intervention agreements, economic intervention agreements. They are the ones that establish through military agreements the guidelines. They are the ones that establish redirections or cooperation works with specific countries in order to establish biometric controls of their population. They are the ones that establish mechanisms for which the migrants won't be able to reach their country of destination. To turn this transit territory into dangerous territories where the criminal gangs are the active subject is part of an externalization mechanism of the borders. To turn this territory into a dangerous territory can be translated into providing arms and creating political destabilization in a territory. It is enough to mention the case of Mexico, the case of Colombia, to realize which were the interventions in those countries and how the relationship between the weapons production and drug trafficking are established directly from the intervention of the countries of the North. Another characteristic of the border externalization has to do with analyzing what the book analyzes, which is the lie between the different categories, the category of the migrant and the category of refugee. So how do we dwell on this difference? And how do we take this to the territory? And how do we externalize this? Well, through the visas, controlling and providing countries in countries that control who can deserve or not a visa and who can deserve or not with the crossing or with the transit. How do they obtain that visa? Well, that visa is obtained by selling the facial biorecognition system to African countries, for example. So who sell those control systems? Well, the companies that establish the border control mechanisms. So what are we talking about? We are talking about companies, we are talking about economic groups that are present in the military interventions of the countries that are mainly called the global south countries, companies that are related to the NATO, countries that are related to the wars that took place starting after the second Gulf War, which are producers of weapons, companies that mainly produce control technology, and companies that also produce the difference between the migrants and the refugees, but that also produce the consideration that every migrant is a criminal and that the first thing that has to be done is to establish the category of the type of criminality that that person has when that person reaches a border. It seems like the most beautiful thing of this book, and I do believe that the book is completely poetic. The most beautiful thing is that in order to put an end to the industry of the asylum and in order to put an end to the industry that includes the exploitation of the migrants, what the book shows is that what we must guarantee is the right to not migrate. The first right that we must guarantee is the right to not migrate. But to guarantee this right, this means to guarantee the right to the non-intervention, political intervention or military intervention, is to guarantee the right to the economical autonomy of all territories, and most of all is to guarantee the right to the no colonialism and to guarantee the struggle of all the peoples for the decolonization. The right to not migrate implies the destruction of the capitalism, and therefore somehow this book is central and crucial to understand one of the most beautiful things that the book says, and that is that the refuge at the end is the recognition of the refuge to the damage, and all the persons who live in the system are part of that unfortunate damage generated by the expropriation. Thank you very much, Florencia. I believe that we must continue to analyze this. And in Argos, we are dwelling into the topic that has to do with the externalization of the border. As we were able to see recently with the new migrations law of Chile, this is precisely an example of what you were commenting. And in Argos, we have issued a communique manifesting our concern for this law that was passed a few days ago by Chile. Thank you very much, everyone.
This analysis shows a different perspective of this process and the topics which are intertwined. As Siobhán and Adrienne say, the expansion of neoliberal capitalism not only leads to forced migration, but also requires an itinerant labor that created by intimidation, the production of another, which is exploited and racialized, is the basis of our economic model. The figure of migrant worker, illegal worker, is just a recent personification of this historic process. I took these words from the book. This is a very important work that opened our eyes in this matter. You can find it in the pmpress.org, asylum, and also when we are going to resume this discussion in the second segment, we can show the book. Also, the publication of Argos could be found in our web page, argosob.org, in the Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, at Argos OB. We want to greet brothers and sisters of the Code Pink organization. They are co hosting this webinar. Going back to our panel, let's continue with this conversation. And we have a question that is addressed to our panel as a whole. Based with this on this global scenario, geopolitical scenario, how do you analyze the current situation of the US migration policies in light of the allegations of overcrowding of children in detention centers and the maintenance of policies that President Biden had promised in his campaign to eradicate? Adrienne, you could perhaps give us your opinion regarding this question. Thank you, Lucrecia. During the campaign, the presidential campaign, migration was a centerpiece in the debate. Many of those who supported Biden used xenophobia and the fact that Trump had talked about genocide, and they said that Biden was going to be better than Trump. So Biden and Obama, they built those cages for migrants. I'm not saying that Biden and Obama's policies were responsible for the surge of the migrant wave arriving. And then we have this hypocrisy if they are economic migrants or not. Most people fleeing Central America, they are fleeing because of the support of Obama's administration, Biden administration, of the coup d'etat, the Central American plan, the Alliance for Prosperity devised by Biden in 2014, where we had the unaccompanied kids crisis. So they emphasized the Trump fascism. They hide the fact that Biden and Obama were deporter in chief, as Siobhán said. So it was not a surprise when Biden didn't fulfill his promises and the hopes pinned by so many people on him that everything will going to be better in the border, as talking about border, as Bartolo did, this extension that reaches Guatemala and Honduras and third safe countries. With Biden, what do we see today? Well, he continues financing the Alliance for Prosperity that giving more money do the militarization and the mega development projects. They want to send $4 billion to Central America to so-called fight the root causes of migration. Biden and the Vice President Kamala Harris, they have been in a tour in these countries, so-called investigating the root causes of migration. But they are not going to investigate themselves. And imperialism is the very cause of the problem. They are talking about the gangs, violence, cultural problems. In the meantime, they're giving the excuse to implement a stronger imperialism and the hard capitalism in the area. As Bartolo mentioned, they have forced Mexico and Guatemala to militarize their borders, prevent people from entering, from crossing, and the kids remain in cages. Kids are in migrant prisons in the border, and they, under international law, they they prevent migrants to cross the border in clear violation of international law. Therefore, what we see is the continuation of Trump's policies, but with different terminology. Instead of talking about the concrete wall, we have technological walls that generate far more profit than Trump's wall. So it is the same pattern of application of neoliberal fascism to migration policies that eventually benefit the US narrative and the imperialist project. And it is done to the detriment of millions of people who are suffering as a result of these policies. Thank you so much, Adrienne. Based on what you've said, there are different categories of migrants, and they are built politically based on the interest of the foreign policy of the various countries. In the case of the US, some migrants are applied strong securitization policies, but in the case of the Venezuelan migrants, the policy is positive discrimination towards Venezuelan migrants. The TPS and other benefits that they receive and to foster the migration of Venezuelans. So this is very important to bear in mind. Also, Bartolo, could you give us your opinion regarding this question, please, your feedback? Well, the US, they have classified who the friends and foes are. And they cannot recognize that people are fleeing from a country they are supporting. They do not accept the fact that a friendly country is living in awful conditions. They do not tolerate that reality. And this has resulted in these policies of intervention in those countries. So this is a manner to explain this flow of migrants. They say that they flee because they are criminals. And Trump said that the caravan of migrants were organized by the mafia and that the 100 Syrians terrorists were part of the caravans. In Mexico, they have been stigmatized as rapers, criminals, violent people. To say that these guys, they should be happy in Honduras, but this is a political move against the friendly government of the United States in Honduras. And I've been accused of being an instigator because I am an enemy of the government of Honduras. But the caravans I have accompanied, they have nothing to do with the protest actions we organize to topple this narco dictatorship that we have supported by the US. Migration is not the one living in caravans. Today, we see thousands of migrants. They have been captured in the southern part of the United States, and they have not, they have not, we have not have many caravans, but the flow is permanent. But instead of addressing the root causes of people leaving, they criminalize these people. Since they are criminals, well, they need to be attacked by the troops, by the military troops. We need to harden the border with trained military people ready to kill. So those women with the two children, because they cannot pay their houses, a trained military is there ready to kill them. And Guatemala is doing that, and Mexico as well, following the orders of the US. The budgets of our countries, instead of addressing the causes of migration, they are devoted to purchase vehicle, arms, and to pay military personnel created by the United States in order to stop migrants considered by them as criminals. The US, they want a migration. Trump said so. But they want them from Holland, from Norway, etc. But the truth of the matter, and to inform those who consider migration as a menace, it is a benefit to the US. We generate billions of dollars in savings to US business, and they received half the salary that they should normally receive. If they send $5.4 billion only to Honduras, they mean that they won $12 billion. The U.S. business sector, they have made billions exploiting these migrants. There's a lot of hypocrisy because they need cheap labor, and U.S. entrepreneurs tell Hondurans, listen, ask your family to come because I have a job for you. Thousands do not reach because they are kidnapped and murdered. And the US police forces and the Mexican police, they are accomplices, not only because of the business, because it's a huge business, but also because it is another invisible wall. Crimes are committed by the Mexican police and the US police. So this is a deterrent to people to leave Honduras and go to the US. So there is no humanitarian policy. There is no consideration as human beings. They are treated as an enemy they need to combat and to destroy, as a menace to the security of these people. Migrants are not so, they are workers. And here they do not have opportunities, and they're trying a decent way to earn a livelihood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bartolo. Thank you to the other panelists. It seems like all the hopes that we had in this new government in the United States, it seems that during the first few months of their exercising power, the migration policy, as well as the security policy, and the policy that has to do with the global South countries is the same policy. And it has the same orientation as Trump's government. In the case of the policies that have been applied against Venezuela and the coercive measures that have been issued against the Venezuelan state and that have affected the Venezuelan people, it seems like with this new government, the guideline is the same. I would also like to hear Florencia. I would like to know if in the south of the continent, there is any, if she has any contribution to make from her point of view. Maybe her standpoint might be different. Yes, it seems like it's very interesting to ask ourselves how the geopolitics of the governments of the South have changed given the intervention of the United States. I do believe that in that sense, at least here in these latitudes, the intervention of the United States with regards to migration control policies have other characteristics. And as Lucrecia said, the modification in the Chilean law and the relationship that the United States has with Chile is also part of that intervention logistics around these latitudes. Of course, we must also mention the government of Bolsonaro and the intrinsic relationships it had with the government and the administration of Donald Trump, not only because there are two figures that are exactly the same at that level of generation of hate, but also because of their economical relationships and the geopolitical place that the destabilization occupied of Brazil for the complete stabilization of the whole region. So I believe that in some way, in one way or another, what we are witnessing, at least in these latitudes, is a minimum recomposition of some governments. It's worth to say that Argentina has recovered a traditional policy for the defense of human rights of the migrant people with this new administration, and that we have started to change the orientation of this lawfare process that was led by the United States. We have to see what is going to happen now in the next elections that will be held in Brazil. Now, regarding the specific aspects of the migration categories that have one way or another distinguished the migration policy in the South, I do believe that it's important to emphasize what you mentioned, Lucrecia, about the positive discrimination towards certain economic groups, towards certain migrating groups. This was clearly seen in the policies, the closed policies, the xenophobic policies that are based in different regimes that are xenophobic with other countries. Argentina had a president that said that its borders was some kind of a screen, and that the migrants from Bolivia, from Paraguay, from Brazil that cross those territorial borders have done it historically. So there is some history related to that. So we have that component of history. However, for those populations, there was an intensification of violence, an intensification of persecution. However, in parallel, there was an acknowledgement and an aperture towards the Venezuelan migrants. So in that sense, I believe that it is interesting to mention how the interventions of the United States from a migration's point of view, what they do is a clear distinction between the migrants. I mean, who deserves and who doesn't deserve the refugee, who deserves and who doesn't deserve the right to be given or granted. For example, people from Haiti do not have the right to be recognized as migrants, even though they are the most vulnerable ones. And here, exactly the same situation happened. So we must think about how to establish migration policies that really guarantee that migration is a human right And that is one of the most important characteristics that we could try to consolidate within the region, in the southern region of America. For the time being, since we have the United States very far away, so far we have some sort of independence. Thank you, Florencia, for your analysis. I would also like to read some messages of people who have written on the social media. They're greeting us from the Colombian networks. We have messages from students of the master's degree program of human rights of the Bolivarian University of Venezuela. We also have messages from Victoria, from Córdoba, Argentina. We have messages from Maria Celeste from Buenos Aires. I would also like to comment that there are people that have been writing on the chat. Guillermo says, Florencia's statement about the right to not migrate is very important to denounce the interventionist character of the colonialism. Maria Victoria says, since 1942, there are no humanitarian policies for Latin America. Claudia says, it's an important analysis of the constant of migration and the business around this terrible social fact. I hope that we could find the publication of this important book. Okay, let us continue with our panel. In the case of Siobhán, I believe Siobhán is the only one in the panel who is in Europe. So we would like to take the opportunity to hear her. What can you say about what is happening right now with the migration in Europe, and especially with those people coming from Africa? What is the situation that they're facing today?
Thank you so much. I think I'll start by maybe drawing some parallels to the things that have been spoken about by the other panelists, particularly how these categorizations are interwoven so that the construction of criminal migrants means that you have to create kind of innocent migrants or the victims of crime to become the deserving ones in this constructed idea that there is a limited resource, there is a limited amount of space. And so I just wanted to pick up on one of the points that Flor made about how NGOs are kind of engaged in the construction of particular groups of migrants as kind of deserving. But the word that comes up quite a lot, especially in my work in the US and similarly in Europe, is this idea of innocence. So the idea that there are innocent victims of criminals who are coyotes or smugglers, and there are people who are persecuted for no reason other than maybe their homosexuality or their gender. And this language of innocent is used to kind of justify why certain groups should be given asylum status or should be supported. But every time they are discussed, there's an imaginary of the other side, of the other group. And so we're seeing this a lot in the UK right now and across Europe, where in the UK context, we have a very, very right-wing government. I think a government that is more right-wing than is popularly realized and accepted because there are figures like Bolsonaro, Trump, Modi on the global scene. Our leadership, Boris Johnson, but particularly some of the people in his government, Priti Patel, who's the Home Secretary in charge of kind of migration policy, is a terrifyingly right-wing person in terms of her beliefs. And under her leadership, the Home Office is pursuing an increasingly punitive treatment of asylum seekers, including housing people in former army barracks that are completely unsuitable, completely unlivable. And this is a headline news that that independent evaluators have said that this is unlivable housing, but the government continues with it anyway. everybody's very distracted by COVID and that crisis. That there's a lot of actions and new policies that are coming through without much attention. Another one is this idea of we need to make crossing the English Channel more perilous, more dangerous for people, and we need to criminalize anyone who takes that route. Now, the government has said we recognize that the people who are taking that route are often the victims of crime, but we have to punish them in order to dissuade or to put off the criminals from committing those crimes. So you get this circular logic where you're, even as you're constructing the innocent victims, you're saying that the innocent victims prove the existence of crime, and therefore we have to kind of put all of them in prison. So this is I can talk specifically more to the UK case, but we are seeing kind of similar moves around the EU. But I would say that a lot of it is going on quite quietly, alarmingly quietly, because the news cycle is so dominated by another crisis, and it's another crisis that has elements of protectionism around vaccine sharing, around the securitization of borders to stop new variants of COVID coming in, and so we should close those borders. So we're getting into a very discursively tricky place. So we're kind of, the way that we're talking about borders in relation to COVID is having an effect on the relation we're talking about borders in relation to migration. And so I think it's a very, very challenging time now for people who are advocating for asylum seekers' rights, as advocating for migrants' rights, because we're being forced into a kind of corner where, in order to defend rights, we're often finding ourselves talking about desperation, innocence, people who have done nothing wrong, they were the victims of a crime, but that same language is really feeding into the narrative that migrants in general are dangerous. And it's a really complicated time, because I think a lot of activists are saying to each other, we've got to be really careful here in terms of the constructions that we use to advocate for people, even if we think about the domestic unit of the family. So this idea of we can't deport someone because they're a father, or we can't deport someone because they're a mother, or we can deport someone who is what we can deport someone who has a conviction for drug dealing. So we start getting into, even as advocates, getting into those conversations about who definitely can't go, which means that we're leaving ourselves open to imply that some people can go. And so I think the really radical position that we have to take is to say, it's an abolitionist position. That no one should be forced to move if they don't want to. And I think that goes back to, Lucrecia, your point about thinking about those people who don't want to move at the same time. So certainly these conversations are happening in Europe and echoing back the same debates.
Gracias, Siobhán. Gracias, Adrienne.
Thank you, Siobhán. Thank you, Adrienne, Flor, Bartolo, for all your comments and for your reflections. Adrienne, I would like to know if you have the book, for you to show us the book. People are asking us to show the book. So if we can show only the book in the camera, and where can we find the book? Where can we purchase it? Yes, here it is. Well, we can find the book everywhere, in every large store, bookshop. However, we suggest you can directly go to the PM Press company, which is an editorial company. Here, the link is pmpress.org. / and asylum. but written in English, the way you see it here with a Y. And that will redirect you to the website of our editorial, of our publishing company, PM Press, and there you will find the link to buy the book. You can also find the book in Amazon. The introduction has been translated by Francesca Emmanuel, who is an excellent translator. It is an excellent translation, and it is available also in different sites. AlignNet has one version. If you search for AlignNet and Asylum for Sale, you will find the whole introduction into Spanish.
Thank you, Adrienne. It is a pleasure to show this book that you have co-edited. Warm greetings to all the audience. They are asking questions through the social networks. Let's see the questions of the audience. Since we do not have much time, let's take the first question posed by someone from Washington. Thank you very much for this important event. I write from Washington. I would like to ask, what is your opinion on how migrations are affected by the global health crisis in this pandemic? This question has not been addressed. Could you please make a comment on how migrant populations are affected by the pandemic and the access to the vaccines? Who wish to answer? Adrienne? Yes, I can give you very simple data. COVID 19 in the Americas was the result of deportations. People imprisoned who were deported from the US to their respective countries. Those deportations resulted in the transmission of COVID in Central American countries. And it is as a result of these deportations of these people who have contracted COVID-19 in the border in these detention centers. So so these people were persecuted and criminalized in their countries once they were deported. Many of them were persecuted and criminalized because they were carrying COVID 19. And that led to a surge of cases. I could say much more, but I would like others to participate as well. Yes, whoever wishes to take the floor, you can make your contribution to this topic. As Siobhan said, we need to pay close attention to when the right to defense of health becomes the defense of territories. To protect health means to protect the health of nationals. But those on the other side of the border is none of our business. So the US policy demonstrates this clearly. The US have access to millions of vaccines. All the population has been vaccinated, but the rest of the population do not even have access to vaccines for senior people. So what type of humanity are we looking for? So in South America, for instance, capitalism is updating the idea of borders through the defense of the right to ensure health of peoples within the territory, the nationals. Given the scarcity or the shortage of goods, because migration is also always premised on the shortage of goods. So those goods should be distributed among whom? Well, among those who came first to this territory, the first arriving. So the access to the vaccines is equitable, the production of vaccine is equitable. Well, there we could debate that. So states have the right to organize the way to have access to health. Otherwise, what they do is reproducing the mechanisms of differentiation, division, and economic differentiation. So, human rights defenders, we have a complicated work agenda regarding COVID-19 because the border as such is not a frontier defended because of the nationality aspect, but now is to defend health, the sanitary frontier, is the health frontier, strengthening national frontiers. In this regard, we need to understand that access to health is differentiated, and the access to equity of right is premised on the principles of capitalism. Thank you, Flor. Bartolo, do you have any comments?
Bueno, mira, a mí me parece que hay razón en que los países pues traten
It's
de
reasonable
controlar
that
el
countries
flujo de
try
personas
to
por
control the, the flow of people to
pero
fight
hay una
COVID.
realidad
But the
que
truth of the
esto no
matter
es nada más
is
un
that
pretexto para
this is
frenar
just a
la inmigración.
pretext to stop
Digamos el
migration.
caso de México.
In the case of
México no puede
Mexico,
entrar
for
porque
instance,
por
they say
acuerdo
they cannot
no
enter
podemos,
because
los
of
turistas entran,
uh,
los
uh,
turistas
uh,
vienen de acá,
contamination, but
pero el que va
tourists, they have
hasta
the right to
México,
enter.
ese sí puede entrar, no
Those who
importa que
go
no
to
tenga,
Mexico
¿verdad?
for
Eso lo
tourism,
debe
they
haber
can
arreglado
enter,
antes de
but
que
not
llegara la
migration.
vacuna. ¿Ah?
And it
Y
happened
ahorita
before the
hablaba
vaccine.
de turistas,
We
personas
had
que vienen acá por vuelos
tourists
y eso, la gente
with
pudo a
flights.
ingresar.
People entered Mexico for
Creo que
tourist
fue ahí
purposes.
como anima al dedo, ¿verdad? Esto
So it's been
del
very good for them
COVID-19
to have the
para tratar de
COVID-19
posponer la
pretext
migración.
in order
En
to
Guatemala, por
contain
ejemplo, les
migrations.
dieron garrote
In Guatemala,
a los migrantes, los
they hit
golpearon, pero no hubo
migrants.
ninguna medida
However,
de
there was no
protección para los
protection
migrantes ni para
measure
la
in
población
favor
guatemalteca.
of
Entonces,
migrants
por el
and
contrario, fue nada más
Guatemalan
un
population.
pretexto.
So
Ahora, en
COVID-19
este
was
momento,
just a
yo creo
pretext.
que no existiría ninguna razón porque ya hay vacuna.
Today, there is
El
no
mundo se
reason
está vacunando
because we have vaccines.
porque
And
entran
in the same manner, they are vaccinating those
por los
entering the
aeropuertos de
country
Estados
through the
Unidos,
airports in the US.
¿no? También podrían
Well,
vacunar
they could also vaccinate
sin necesidad.
migrants. We are human
Entonces, estamos
beings.
en un
The
país,
fact
¿verdad?
that we
Todos
come from a poor
tercermundistas,
third
¿verdad?
world
Con tantos
country
problemas,
with
no
so
quiere
many
decir que
problems,
valgamos
it
menos.
does
Somos
not
seres
mean that
humanos.
we are
Y el
not human
enfoque
beings. We are
para
human
erradicar
beings.
el COVID
So
debe ser
the fight against
universal,
COVID should
debe ser
be a universal
sostenderlo
struggle
a la
to
humanidad
protect
y no proteger
humankind and
solamente a
not
los de mi
to
país.
protect
Eso
those
vamos
coming
ganando
from my
día por
country. We
día,
need to
porque
protect
realmente
humankind as
si
a
saben que
whole.
venimos de un país
So if
donde
they know that we
empezamos
come from a country where
con
we
mucha más
hardly have
necesidad,
enough
debe
to
de ser
eat,
una actitud
well,
solidaria
there
y
must be
todo
more
lo posible
solidarity and
honestamente y
share
producido
with these
esa
poor
vacuna que
people
proteja la
that
enfermedad y
vaccination, that vaccine that
representa a
protect
la
them
población a
against
la cual ellos van a llegar.
disease and also protect the population
Y en
of the
lugar
countries they
de
are
decir
going to.
para
Instead of
erradicar el COVID,
repressing
más bien deberían de
people, they
poner la
should
población
contribute and
en
help this
posibilidad. No en
population,
Honduras, no se ha
which is so
vacunado a
poor.
nadie.
In Honduras,
Falta
no one
6.000
has been
personas nada
vaccinated,
más,
only
ni
3,000
siquiera todos en
people,
el sistema de salud.
and not even those in the health
Hubiera
care
favorecido, hubiera
sector.
beneficio
So it
al
will be very
presidente, a
good
cualquier hondureño, en otro
if
país, ¿verdad?
Hondurans in
Protegen
other
a los
countries
suyos.
are protected through the vaccination. Thank you very much, Bartolo. And Siobhan, with your comments regarding protection of migrants in the framework of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's, as others have said, it's this kind of limited resource. We have to pay attention to the votes as well. That bringing it back to this question of the economic question, that governments are not only refusing to share their resources, but are also voting against proposals to remove patents, so that the companies that are making the vaccines would have to share the way that they make the vaccine, so that it would be we'd be able to see generic versions of the vaccines made available, so that our governments are voting together and saying, yes, we it's very sad what's happening elsewhere, but we want to protect the economic interests of the companies that are based in the global north as well. So it's not just a matter of we want our populations protected, but we want our corporations protected as well. So I think that's a very important additional element, but certainly echo what everyone else has said. We're seeing the same dynamics here in Europe.
Sí, para finalizar, una pregunta más.
In closing, we have another question to Adrienne in the chat of the social media. What, in the case of global migration flows in the coming 5 years, what will happen with these migration flows in the coming 5 years, in your opinion? Of course, it is a very vast question. If we do not change the direction we are heading, which is neoliberal fascism, well, we call them flows, but these are family tragedies for those suffering the situation. The displacement will increase more and more. And what Flor said a while ago, the right to not migrate, as she said, also we need to change the system so people can enjoy this right of not migrating, so they can stay in their communities. The United States should stop intervening in other countries. We need to stop unilateral coercive measures and forcing people to leave their countries, and also climate change, also generated by profit, capitalism. Without this thirst for profit, wouldn't be destroying the climate and forcing people to flee. So it depends on us, on our struggle, what migration flows will be. But if we do not fight and try to change the situation of neoliberal fascism, things are going to be worse. Matters are going to get worse. And it's not as the media say in the US, that there's a tragedy that we are so many migrants trying to enter the country, but rather it's the suffering of the migrants. And that's the main focus here, the suffering of migrants. And we cannot say that they are defined by suffering, which is the popular framework in which we approach migrants. We need to defeat capitalism to ensure the right to stay in your communities without migrating. So thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you to all the panelists. We are now going to end this important forum and this discussion that we had about the book. The book was the driving force of this topic that has to do with the commodification of migration. It was a pleasure to have this audience that logged in from the different platforms from Argos, PM Press. We wanted to thank the publishing company for the organization of this event. We would also like to thank our friends from Combat. We invite you to follow the agenda of activities of Argos through the social media networks and through our website. Before we end, we would just like to ask you to send your greetings to all the people who joined us, to all the audience. Thank you. Thank you all so much for providing these spaces for these meetings. In this place that is quite solitary, I have learned a lot. And you could see it, right? That I have learned a lot. I have gained a lot of knowledge and I am very interested in reading the whole book. I've already read the introduction, which is in Spanish. And since I lived that experience, I reached the wall in Tijuana and I saw the aggressive attitude against our people. And the agents, the immigration agents of the United States, I could see how they asked for money from people who were there waiting in Tijuana. So that was terrible. Unfortunately, the book is in English, and I hope that soon we can have it available in Spanish in order for me to learn a lot. I do agree on the fact that migration and not only the asylum, they have become a business. Thank you very much to the writers of this book. I encourage you all to continue studying this phenomenon that represents a suffering for millions of people in our continent. So thank you very much. Thank you, Bartolo, and thank you for your tireless work for the people who are migrating. Florencia, would you like to express your greetings or your farewell for the audience and the panelists? Yes, I wanted to thank you for this meeting, for this possibility. I believe it is quite notable, the work that our friends have done when writing this book. On one hand, it is absolutely important to read the information that they present and the analysis of the information. And on the other hand, it's absolutely poetical. They have had that capacity to introduce poetry, to narrate about a cruelty. As Adrienne said, I believe that the purpose that we all have here is to realize about the power of the migrating people. We must disseminate not only the oppression and the fact that we deserve that asylum, maybe because we are very poor and we have very few tools. On the contrary, we do have enough tools to fight in our territories for the independence and for the autonomy. So thank you very much for this possibility. Thank you, Flor, for sharing your view today, for your background, for the knowledge that you have about this topic, of such an important topic that has to do with the situations in the borders. So in order to end, we will hear the closing speech of Siobhán. We would like you to express your final message, Siobhán.
Thank you so much to everyone for Argos for hosting this event and for educating me so much. Everyone who shared their thoughts, including the people who asked questions and shared comments on Facebook and on Twitter, and sorry, on YouTube, maybe on Twitter. But it's been really gratifying because although, as Adrienne was saying, there's a very scary future ahead of us, I think that the way that we push back is by forming more and more bridges of solidarity across borders, and saying that we refuse this packaging of us in different closed nations, and actually we're building more bridges than walls that are built against us. So thank you so much for hosting this conversation, and hopefully it's just an ongoing one.
Gracias, Siobhán.
Thank you, Siobhán. You can find the book, as we said before, on the following website, www.pmpress.org/asylum. There, you can have access to the book and you can support this important initiative. So, in order to end this meeting, Adrienne, we would like you to give your message, and we would like to tell you that it was a pleasure for us to have you here as well as the rest of the panelists. Well, I would just like to thank you again. I would like to thank Argos, PM Press, and Code Pink for co-sponsoring this meeting. Bartolo, thank you so much for participating here. It's an honor to share this space with you and with Flor and Siobhán as well. So thank you, Lucrecia, as well. I would also like to tell the audience that I am quite grateful. And I would like to repeat what Siobhán just said, which is the most important thing. The more solidarity we show internationally and the more we recognize the processes that we live, the highest solidarity we will have in order to be able to put an end to those capitalist and violent processes that are denying people their right to not migrate. Thank you very much. Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you, Florencia, Siobhán, Bartolo. We would also like to thank the simultaneous interpretation team who always make an effort and confront a challenge in order to interpret in real time what the panelists say. I will also end by citing a phrase of a Colombian friend who wrote this in the chat: solidarity is the tenderness of people, and that has been demonstrated today. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for joining us today, and we hope we can have you here in our next meetings. Thank you very much, and goodbye.